condemned as worthless, 4 Apache women were saved by the loneliest man in the territory. The first thing I found was a moccasin. Just the one, lying in the creek bed about 40 yards below the Ritter crossing, half buried in sand and stiff from the cold. Size of a child's foot or a small woman's. Elk hide, old stitching along the toe, a little beadwork in blue and white that had mostly worn off. I stood there with it in my hand for a while. The creek was running low that October bad summer, low snowpack, and the stones showed white in the bed, and the cottonwoods above me had already gone yellow and brittle. I should have kept moving. I had a line to ride, a full 40 miles of territorial boundary that was my job to check before the cold set in hard, and I was already 2 days behind on account of a lame horse. I kept looking at the moccasin. My name is Cal Briggs. I was 53 years old that fall. I had been the Deputy Territorial Marshal for the Cholla Basin District for 11 years, which sounds like something. But by then the district office in Tucson had made clear they were waiting on a younger man to come available before they made any changes. That was how they put it, waiting on a younger man to come available. I had killed 4 men in the line of duty, settled 2 range wars without a shot, and ridden more bad country than most men twice my experience. And what I was an inconvenience they were too polite to fire outright. My wife, Alina, had been dead 6 years. We had no children. I lived in a 2-room adobe on the edge of Crescent Wells that I rented from a widow named Poole who didn't speak to me except to collect the rent. The town of Crescent Wells had about 260 people in it, and I knew maybe 40 of them well enough to say good morning. The rest had learned to look at the badge and pass the man wearing it, which is a particular kind of invisible that takes some getting used to. I put the moccasin in my saddlebag and rode upstream. What I found, about a 1/4 mile above the crossing in a hollow of red rock under an overhang, was 4 women and a dead fire. They were Apache. 3 of them were older than me, 1 of them considerably, and the 4th was maybe 30, hard to say, with a child's blanket wrapped around her shoulders and a cut on her forehead that had scabbed over crooked and would scar that way. They were not hiding exactly. They were too tired to hide. They were sitting in the way people sit when they have given up thinking about what comes next and are just waiting to find out. The oldest one looked at me, not at the badge, at me. Just my face, steady and flat, the way an elder looks when they've seen enough of the world that a white man on a horse is only one more version of something they already know. I stepped down. I did not draw. I took my hat off, which I do not know why I did, habit maybe, or something my mother put in me, and I said, in the Spanish that I use when I have no Athabascan, that I was not going to hurt them. The one with the cut on her head translated that for the others. She spoke quietly. The oldest woman said something back, and the one with the cut, I found out later her name was Lupe, the name given her by the priests at the school in Benson, not her Apache name, which she kept to herself for 3 weeks before she told me. Lupe said to me in English that was better than my Spanish, "The old one wants to know what you want." I said I found a moccasin down at the crossing. I held it out. One of the other older women made a sound. Lupe translated and then said, "That is hers. She lost it when they crossed. The water was high." I said the water wasn't high. The water was low. Lupe looked at me. She said, "We crossed 3 days ago. The water was high 3 days ago." They had been in that hollow for 3 days. No fire after the first night. No food since the crossing. The oldest woman had a bad knee, swollen enough I could see the shape of it through her skirts. And the other 2 older women were exhausted in the way that is not just tired but something deeper, a kind of used up that a night's sleep doesn't fix. I thought about what I was supposed to do. There was a procedure. There was an agency office in Wilcox. There was a form. There were men in Tucson who had opinions about Apache women found on the territorial side of the line, and those opinions varied, and most of them would not result in good outcomes for these 4 women. I unsaddled my horse. I built a fire. I had cornmeal and salt pork and a good-sized piece of hard cheese that I'd been eating off for a week, and I made a pot of mush that wasn't much to look at but was hot. I gave the oldest woman, Lupe called her grandmother, though I don't think they were actually related. I gave grandmother the better of my 2 blankets and rigged what I could with my slicker over the open side of the overhang to cut the wind. Lupe watched all of this without speaking. The others talked among themselves, low and steady. Once the food was going, they warmed to it the way cold people do, not gratefully exactly, not immediately, but with a kind of attention that is its own form of trust. Lupe ate last. She sat across the fire from me and she said, "Why are you doing this?" I said, "Because I found them and they needed help." She said, "That is not a reason. Men find things and do not help." I said, "I suppose they do." She looked at the fire. She said, "We will cause you trouble." I said that I was already in trouble with most of the people who could give it to me, so she shouldn't worry too much on that score. She looked up from the fire. I thought she was going to say something, but she didn't. She just looked at me for a moment with dark level eyes, and then she looked back at the fire. I had a cabin. It was not mine. It belonged to a man named Orrin Flat who had gone back to Missouri 2 years before and left the key with me and said I could use it for patrol layovers. It was a day's ride north of the crossing, up into the Ponderosas, and it was tight and dry and had a stove that worked and a woodpile that I'd been adding to for 2 falls. Orrin had never come back for the key. I made a travois for grandmother. The 2 other older women, I came to know them as Rosie and the tall one. The tall one never gave me even a mission name. They walked without complaint over ground that would have finished a younger man. Lupe walked beside my horse and did not ask for anything. We were 3 days getting to Flat's cabin because I kept the pace to what grandmother could manage and stopped when she needed to stop. The first night I took the first watch and woke Lupe for the second, and she did not argue about it. Just took my rifle and sat by the fire like someone used to keeping watch, which I suppose she was. The second morning she made something from dried things she had in a pouch at her belt. I never found out what it was, some root or berry, and she boiled it into a paste and put it on grandmother's knee with a strip of cloth, and the old woman sat straighter after that. I watched her do it. She worked quickly and without fuss. Her hands were not gentle exactly, they were sure, which is better. She felt me watching. She said, without looking up, "In the school they taught me to cook and to sew and to obey." She said it flatly, the way you say a fact about weather. I said, "Who taught you medicine?" She said, "My mother, before the school." I didn't say anything to that. She finished with grandmother's knee and then she did look up. She said, "You are not what I expected." I said I probably wasn't what most people expected, but usually for other reasons. She didn't smile, but something shifted, somewhere around the eyes. We got to Flat's cabin on the 3rd afternoon with an hour of good light left. I split wood while Lupe and Rosie and the tall one made the inside habitable. They knew how to do this fast and without instruction, and what they did with the space in an hour was better than anything I could have managed. Grandmother sat in the one chair and directed, and the others listened to her and ignored me, which was as it should be. That night I slept in the lean-to with my horse. In the morning, Lupe brought me a tin cup of coffee and stood in the lean-to door and said, "What happens now?" I said I needed to think about that. She said, "There is an agency." I said yes. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "We were at the agency." She said it the way you'd say we were in a burning building, just stating the fact of why you left. I didn't ask her to say more than that. I said I would figure something out. I said I wasn't going to send them back to anything that had already broken wrong. She looked at me for a long time. She said, "Why?" I said, "Because I said I wouldn't." She took the empty cup back when I was done and walked back to the cabin without another word. The trouble came, as trouble does, on a schedule of its own. A man named Harker rode up to the cabin 12 days after we got there. He was a deputy from the county sheriff's office out of Wilcox, not territorial, which made his authority here a gray area, but Harker was not a man much interested in gray areas. He had a piece of paper and a man behind him whose name I didn't catch, and a way of sitting a horse that was meant to communicate that he was comfortable with what he was about to do. He said there had been a complaint from some ranchers down by the crossing, said there were Apache women squatting on territorial land, said his paper was an order of removal. I was standing in the yard. The cabin door was behind me. I said, "Let me see the paper." I read it. I handed it back. I said the paper was a county instrument and this was territorial land and his paper had no force here. Harker said that was a creative interpretation. I said I was the territorial deputy marshal for this district, and I'd been creative before, and it had held up. He looked at me. He looked at the cabin. He said, "You're helping savages, Briggs." Said it like it explained something sad about me, like it confirmed a thing he'd suspected for a while. I said these women were on territorial land under my jurisdiction and my protection. I said if he produced a territorial warrant signed by a district judge, I would read it carefully and consider it seriously. I said until then I would thank him to take his creative piece of paper and his friend and ride back down out of my mountains. The man behind Harker put his hand near his gun. I looked at him. I kept looking at him. He moved the hand. Harker said he'd be back. I said I'd be here. They rode out. I stood in the yard for a while after. My heart was going harder than I would have liked, but my hands were steady, which has always been the thing I could count on. Whatever else goes, the hands stay steady. I heard a sound behind me. I turned. Lupe was standing in the cabin doorway. She had been there for some or all of it. She was looking at me with an expression I could not immediately read, not relief, not gratitude, something more complicated, something that was working something out. She said, "You did not give ground." I said, "No." She said, "They will come back." I said, "Probably." She said, "And when they do?" I said, "Same answer." She looked at me for another long moment. Then she said quietly something in Apache. I asked her what it was. She said, "There is a word. It means a man who does not move from where he stands." She paused. She said, "It is not a common word. We do not use it often." She went back inside. I rode to Tucson. It took me 4 days round trip, and I left my rifle with Lupe, and she took it without comment and checked the load, which told me what I needed to know about whether she could use it. In Tucson, I called in 11 years of unreturned favors. The district marshal, a man named Cordell who I had once pulled out of a river in flood, owed me more than most. I sat in his office and I told him what I had and what I needed. He looked at his desk for a long while. He said, "Cal, you know what you're asking." I said I knew. He said, "You're already on their list for replacement." I said I was aware. He said, "This will finish it." I said, "I know that too. I need the paperwork." He looked at me. He said, "You always were a damn stubborn man." I said that was probably true. He wrote the letter. It was not a perfect instrument. It was a letter of provisional protective custody, territorial rather than federal, which meant it had a limited life and could be challenged. But it had the district seal and Cordell's signature, and that was enough to make Harker's piece of paper into kindling. I rode back. The cabin was fine. Lupe had used the rifle exactly once. She told me, a rattlesnake that came under the door and had otherwise kept things tight. Grandmother's knee was better. Rosie had found where someone had tried to start a kitchen garden behind the cabin and had extended it considerably with her own knowledge of what would grow in that elevation and that soil. The tall one had done something to the stove that made it draw better. Lupe gave me back the rifle. She said, "Rosie wants to know if you like squash." I said I did. She said, "You will have a great deal of squash then." I said that was all right. She looked at the territorial letter in my hand. She said, "What does it say?" I told her what it said, what it could do and what it couldn't. I told her it bought time but not a permanent answer. I said I was going to keep working on a permanent answer. She said, "You went to Tucson for us." I said, "Yes." She said, "You put your position at risk." I said, yes. She was quiet for a moment. She said, is there no one who does that for you? I said, not recently. She looked at the floor of the lean-to, then back at me. She said, that is a very wrong thing. I said it was how it had been for a while. She said it should not be. I didn't answer. There wasn't a good answer. She took the empty rifle case from my hand. I'd been holding it while we talked, just turning it over, the way you hold something when your hands need an object. And she set it on the rack, and then she stood close to me, not touching, just near, and she said, I am going to say something and I need you to hear it. I said, all right. She said, I have watched you for 3 weeks. I watched you build a fire for old women you did not know. I watched you make a travois so grandmother did not have to walk on a bad knee. I watched you stand in a yard and not move when a man put his hand near his gun. I watched you go to a city and spend the credit you had been saving and come back with a piece of paper so that we would be safe. She stopped. She said, I see what you are. She said, not everyone sees clearly, but I see clearly, and what you are is a man who can be counted on. She said it straight, looking at me. No softness or performance in it, just a statement the way you'd state a measurement, something known and precise. I did not say anything. I am not good at being seen. Alina used to say I was the only man she knew who got embarrassed by a compliment, and she was right about that. Lupe said, I am not the agency. I am not the school. I am not those ranchers. I say what I see. I said, I know that. She said, good. She put her hand flat on my chest, just for a moment, not a gesture, not a signal, just a thing she did the way you'd touch a wall to feel if it was solid. Then she took it away and said that Rosie had made something for supper and I should come inside. The permanent answer took 4 months. Cordell had a contact with the Indian Agency office in Washington, who had been looking for exactly this kind of situation to run a quiet pilot on Apache women with no tribal role, no reservation attachment, women who had come loose of the system from every direction. It was not ideal, what they finally worked out. Nothing is ideal. But it had federal standing, and it had Cordell's name on it, and it had my name on it as supervising territorial officer. And it meant that Flat's cabin and the 40 acres around it were documented as occupied and under territorial protection, and that Harker's County instruments could not touch it. I signed the papers in February in Cordell's office. He shook my hand and said, they're going to give your district to that young man from Colorado. I said I figured. He said, what will you do? I said I had a few ideas. What I did was go back to Flat's cabin, which was not Flat's cabin anymore, not really, not the way it had been. Rosie's garden had been under snow for months, but she had it mapped in her head, and she already knew what she was going to plant when the ground thawed. The tall one had repaired the linta with a thoroughness that made my original construction look embarrassing. Grandmother had taken over the chair by the stove as if she'd always owned it, which in the ways that matter, she now did. And Lupe. I found Lupe in the yard splitting wood when I rode in. She was good at it, clean strokes, no waste. She looked up when she heard the horse and she read my face before I could say anything. She said, it's settled. I said, it's settled. She set the axe head on the block and left it standing there, and she walked up to me and she looked at the papers in my hand and then she looked at my face. She said, you gave up your position. I said it was time anyway. She said it was not time, you gave it up. I said I gave it for something worth more. She was quiet. She looked at me in that clear, measuring way she had that I had come to know meant she was deciding whether a thing was true. She decided. She nodded once. Then she did something she had not done before. She put both hands flat on my chest, right over the coat, and she leaned her forehead against my chin and stood like that, not saying anything. I put my arms around her. My hands are big, always have been, ranchers' hands, and they felt like they fit right, which was something I had not felt in a long time. We stood like that in the yard, while the horse dropped his head and blew a long breath, and the pines up the slope moved in the wind. After a while she said, into my coat, 53 is not old. I said, that's debatable. She said, I am debating it. I said, all right. She leaned back and looked at me. She said, you are a man who can be counted on. I will count on you, she said. Is that agreeable? I said it was. We went inside. Grandmother was in her chair. She looked at us when we came in together and said something short in Apache. Lupe answered her. The old woman made a sound, not a laugh, older than a laugh, and looked at the stove. I asked Lupe what she'd said. Lupe said, she said it took you long enough. I said she might be right. Lupe said, she is usually right, you will learn that. Rosie brought coffee. The tall one came in from outside and looked at us, and then looked at the ceiling with the expression of a woman who has known this was coming for some time and finds everyone else's surprise tiresome. The stove ticked. The wind moved in the pines. Outside the window the sky was going that particular color it goes in February in high country, not dark yet but thinking about it, the blue going deep and cold and clear. The kind of sky that tells you the night will be cold, but the morning will be sharp and bright and fully itself. I drank the coffee. My district was gone. My badge was in my pocket for the last time. I had 40 acres of ponderosa, a cabin, a government document, a garden that would come up in spring, and a woman who looked at me like I was exactly what I was and found that sufficient. Sufficient, that was the word. I had not felt sufficient in a very long time.